Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Marcus Harris. I am the Director of Student Interns and Policy Lectures here at the Family Research Council. I want to welcome all of you who are joining us live here at our Washington, D.C. offices, and for all those who are watching via live web stream. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing to you today's Policy Lecture speaker, Dr. Carol Swain. Dr. Swain is a professor of political science and law at the Vanderbilt University. She is passionate about empowering others to confidently raise their voices in the public square. Dr. Swain's education and experience make her a credible and powerful force for change in today's social and political climate when conservatives are intimidated to champion an often unpopular message. She is the author of a number of award-winning books, including Black Faces, Black Interests, the Representation of African Americans in Congress, which won, by the way, the Woodrow Wilson Prize for Best Published Book in the U.S. on Government, Politics, and International Relations in 1994, and was also cited in 2 Supreme Court cases. Professor Swain's other books also include Be the People, A Call to Reclaim America's Faith and Promise, Debating Immigration, and The New White Nationalism in America, Its Challenge to Integration, which was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. In addition to being an author and a professor, if that's not enough, Dr. Swain has served on the Tennessee Advisory Committee to the U.S. Civil Rights Commission and the National Endowment for the Humanities Council. She is a frequent commentator on Fox News, CNN, NPR, and a number of many other media outlets. Today, Dr. Swain will be discussing her latest book that she co-authored, which is called Abduction, How Liberalism Steals the Hearts and Minds of Our Children, which, as we know, with all the craziness that we see going on college campuses these days, is a very timely message. So please join me in welcoming to the stage Dr. Carol Swain.
Good afternoon. I really appreciate everyone that took the time to spend your lunch hour with me, those that are online, as well as the people, that braved whatever traffic or whatever you had to do to get here today. I appreciate that. And before I get into the meat of the discussion, those of you who don't know anything about me, I will give you just a brief little background. I was one of 12 children born and raised in rural poverty in southwestern Virginia. I was a high school dropout. We all dropped out of school after completing the 8th grade. I married at 16, had my first child at 17, got a high school equivalency, and then went on to get 5 college and university degrees. I never sought to become a university professor, but I would say God and life opened up those doors and steered me in that direction. I've been very successful, even though I've not particularly felt, that was where I was called to be. And I've recently announced that I'm taking early retirement from my position at Vanderbilt, not meaning that I step out of the public sphere. I'm just ready and excited for whatever God has next for me to do. So that's a little background. And there's a 6-minute video online that talks about my life. And so it has reenactments. It was put together by Coral Ridge Ministries. I had nothing to do with putting it together. It's very well done, and so it really depicts some of the poverty I came from. And so that's part of my bona fides to criticize and critique, this society that we live in. I might also add that I've had real jobs in my life other than being a university professor, which is a pretty cushy job. I have worked in nursing homes. I've worked in a garment factory. I've worked as a sales clerk. I've sold objects from door to door. And when I was getting my bachelor's degree at Roanoke College, where I graduated magna cum laude, I was working 40 hours a week at the community college library, nights and weekends. And so my story is the American dream story. I believe in America, and I want the best for all of our children. And so with that, out there, I will talk about this book, Abduction, How Liberalism Steals the Hearts and Minds of Our Children. And it's a very different kind of book for me. It's the second of my publications that are geared towards the public. In 2011, I published Be the People, A Call to Reclaim America's Faith and Promise. And that book was a call for we the people to stand up and be the people that would reclaim America. And the reason I wrote Be the People is that there was so much happening in 2009. And you think at the time, 78% of the American people professed to be Christians. And even today, a high percentage of people proclaim to believe in God, some form of God. But when you looked at what was happening in the world, it was so ungodly. It made me wonder, how could it be in a country where the overwhelming majority of people profess to be Christian, you were getting these kinds of policy outputs? And so I felt that that book needed to be written primarily for Christians and conservatives, because it was clear to me that they did not know the tenets of their faith. And they also, if they were Christians, they didn't understand, the Bible and how God lays it out. And with our system of government, it is we the people. We select the politicians. They make those programs and policies on our behalf. And if we don't like what they're doing, then we have to look at ourselves, because we are ultimately responsible. I think God will hold us accountable. And so that was the Be the People book. And this last election, I believe, was a We the People moment. I think it was the American people asserting themselves against elites. There's too much elite control, I believe, in America, and that they're responsible for these policy outputs that we see that are destructive. And unfortunately, a lot of it is coming from our Ivy League schools. So you're here to hear about Abduction. Now, Abduction is a book that I was approached by my co-author, Steve Fazell. Steve is a filmmaker, and he's been a pastor. And he, for many years, had just watched how the children of Christians were being just stolen away into secularism. And we both have experienced tales of, parents coming up to situations where they send their kid off to college, and by Thanksgiving, the child is rejecting, the Judeo-Christian values. And that's happening. And we also see it even with private, with middle schools. Sometimes it starts as early as middle school. And so it was really, Steve's idea. And so he approached me some years ago, asked would I co-author. At the time, I was busy, so I said no. And but he came back maybe about 2 years ago, and that was during the time that I was going through a lot of turmoil related to an opinion piece I happened to write about Islam on my campus, and I was on sabbatical. But also I decided to co-author this book because I felt like since he did come back, that maybe God wanted me to be a part of this project, and I certainly had seen everything he was talking about. And so we put our heads together and we wrote this book, Abduction, How Liberalism Steals the Hearts and Mind, our children's hearts and minds. And the way, what we do in the book, we talk about the aggressive secular agenda to indoctrinate children with a worldview that rejects the traditional morality associated with the Judeo-Christian worldview. And this new morality that we see pushed, just across America, it's not just the schools, but we see it with the media. There are no absolute rights or wrongs. And you can see it with just how, I don't want to be accused of picking on Islam, but when it comes to things like, the genital mutilation or the treatment of women, you see the feminists and all of these people are silent, and you wonder, why are they silent? How could they not be speaking out? Well, because of this relativism. What's right for you is right for, for your right is not the same as my right, and all of this stuff like that, that there are no absolute rights and wrongs. We know with the traditional morality that's rooted in our Judeo-Christian values and principles, there are rights and wrongs, and sometimes, we have to inconvenience ourselves. It's not about us. And, what makes us comfortable, we really have to put other people ahead of us. And so part of what we're doing in the book is trying to counter, this dangerous philosophy that I believe, and Steve believes, and I'm sure many of you all, that it is partially responsible for the chaos we see taking place on university campuses these days, and just for the total rejection of the rule of law, and no respect for authority, no respect whatsoever. That is something that's certainly not rooted in any type of traditional morality. And we're not just talking about Christians and Jews, but in just about every culture, there's respect for the wisdom of the elders. And you see I have this gray hair that I'm not covering up. That's to show that I have wisdom. And you would think that I'd be able to get away with more because I'm, having this gray hair. You'd also think I'd be able to get away with more because I'm African American and I came from poverty. But no, that's not the way this new morality operates. Because I am conservative, I get no points for being black. I get no points for being a woman. And it's just a total, it rejects everything that's traditional. I get treated like an old white man. And in today's culture, that's not a position that you'd want to have, but I would say that that's how I've been treated. What is scary about this culture that we're in that targets our children is that it uses the institutions that we once trusted. We trusted certain institutions like our public and private schools to inculcate certain values. We find that public and private schools, the colleges and universities, and most of the earliest ones were founded by people that were Christians. These were the earliest institutions. Many of them were led by pastors, but we find that colleges and universities, public, private schools, the entertainment industry, hopeless, and once trusted organizations like the Boy Scouts, the Girl Scouts, our churches, we find many of them pushing towards this liberal agenda. And with many of the liberal churches, they have become, I would say, agents of Marxism, that they are pushing social justice. They're not pushing a biblical worldview. In fact, many of them are just totally rejected, the biblical stories that we believe on faith that has to do with the virgin birth and just the core parts of Christianity. A lot of that is totally rejected by certain churches, and they're pushing this new morality, and they're doing it, under the umbrella of the church or under the umbrella of organizations, and they hijacked the civil rights movement a long time ago, but using the civil rights movement to justify behaviors that are just totally counter to our Judeo-Christian roots. And anyone that would argue that America does not have Judeo-Christian roots, that would be someone that would be totally uninformed. There's no way you can read the early Supreme Court decisions, justice stories, opinions, and the charters of the colonies. Many of them had religious charters that it was very much about advancing at the time pretty much a Christian worldview. And then, we say Judeo-Christian because Christianity, it was birthed out of Judaism. And so we are, we share the same book, the same principles. And so it is a Judeo-Christian culture. And up until probably 1947, the Supreme Court did not have a lot of issue with that. But we see how quickly the political left has just taken over the organizations, taken over the culture, and shifted, our young people and many of our old people from the biblical worldview towards atheism and secularism. And you wonder, how do they do it? Well, they do it by mocking people that believe in God. They use shaming techniques, and it's acceptable to use shaming techniques if they're being geared towards religious believers, it seems, devout religious believers. And so some adults and young people, if we don't really arm our young children, not just with apologetics training, which I think that every church and every Christian child should get, but they need to know every argument that the secular left will throw at them. They need to know the flaws of those arguments, and that has to be a part of their education. Otherwise, some of them will become mincemeat for the liberal left. This new morality I argue, or we argue, is designed to corrupt and sexualize our children. And if you wonder about that, just go into some of the department stores and look at what they're selling, for young kids, even the little ones. It facilitates and grooms them to become objects of adult sexual gratification. And we can see this in court decisions that have weakened the power of parents and strengthened the hand of smut peddlers and those who prey on children. The most recent example, and I will give you a handout on this, is California's child prostitution law, which took effect on January 1st. It's SB 1322. It bars law enforcement from arresting anyone under the age of 18 for soliciting or engaging in prostitution. Now, as the road to hell is paved with good intentions, the good intentions was to protect children from being victims so that they would not have a record if they had engaged in prostitution. But the reality of it makes it harder for the police, to police the situations, because if the child is out there prostituting, you can be sure that the customers are not other children. That's one thing we can be sure of. But no laws are broken. So you can't arrest a child. Under the law, there are certain circumstances where the police can detain a child under certain circumstances. That's just briefly detain them, but they cannot compel them, to testify in court against the pimp or the pedophile or the pornographer that's using the child, and it strengthens the hands of these pimps, prostitutes, and pedophiles while making and creating more child victims. And if you think about law, and people that argue, well, you can't legislate morality, of course you can, and we see it in many different areas, but once you say that prostitution is not illegal when you're under 18, you're going to get more prostitution. And there's something about something that's illegal that I think many of us, we don't want to break the law. There may be some rebels that want to break the law, but there's a deterrent factor in itself in that this is illegal. If I engage in prostitution, I might get caught. This is going to be on my record. And all of this stuff like that, they have removed that stigma. And you think about the child that's being exploited by the pimp or by the pedophile or whomever has them out there working. The day that person becomes 18, they can be arrested for prostitution. And so on its face, it makes no sense at all that you would have a law like this. Yet this is a law that was passed by the state of California. And if you look at some of the Supreme Court decisions that have barred, that have really protected pornographers and have made it more difficult for parents to get certain types of material taken off out of video games or off television or that type of thing, it's all about the adults, gratifying the adults. It's not about the protection of children. And the courts may argue that it's the responsibility of the parent to protect the child, but we see through a series of actions a chipping away of the power of the parents. And in our book, we document a lot of the things that are taking place. In fact, everything in the book is documented, but the book is still easy to read and written for a lay audience. This book has 11 short chapters, and with each chapter we have examples, and we also have our personal stories that Steve, I don't remember the math, but he's at least 10 years older than I am, maybe more. He's an old white man. But we have examples of things that we have experienced, or people that we have encountered, and people that have actually fought back against this. And so there are many people that have seen this coming. They've seen it coming for a long time, and that they have taken actions. And if you think the culture is bad today, it would be a lot worse if it weren't for, the activists, the people that were able to call it out and to think of ways to resist. Our chapters cover the public schools, the music industry, the influence of television, movies, video games, that are geared towards corrupting the morality of our children in all sorts of ways, to just break down their inhibitions and cause them to question themselves. And, one of the sections that I have in the book that I wrote has to do with parenting the gender-confused child, because I believe that we all are going to have gender-confused children and grandchildren before it's over, because the culture is trying to confuse them. When you tell people that their biological, physical anatomy has nothing to do, with their sex, and that they can be any gender they want to be, that confuses them. And I think about myself. When I was young, in grade school, I had a best friend. Her name was Patsy Martin. I loved my best friend. I wanted to do everything with my best friend. I was not in love with Patsy Martin that I thought I would marry Patsy Martin. But in today's culture, I think I would have questioned myself whether there was something wrong with me, or maybe I would want to marry Patsy Martin. I think that many of us have had close friends, that our first close friend may be someone of the same sex. We didn't have to question. And nowadays, like when I have a lot of friends that are single. I'm divorced, they're divorced, or never married. We do things together. People, we have to wonder, well, do people think we're gay? Well, we decided not to care. So we don't care. But just the fact that we live in a culture where, you can't have close relationships between men and women with women without wondering whether someone is going to think there's more to it. That is not the way the society is supposed to operate, but it's the way it does operate, and it creates confusion. And so in that chapter, the section on the section on parenting the gender-confused child, one of the first things I say, that if your child, announces, I'm gay, I'm transsexual, or whatever, don't freak out. That's the worst thing a parent can do, is freak out. The most important thing to do is listen. It could be something very innocent, something that, a teacher or another peer has said, or maybe the kid has been picked on in school. It could be something quite innocent that could be addressed by talking it through. But it could be, more serious. And in that particular case, there are resources. But in any event, I think it's important for parents to support their children, but not support them to the point that you facilitate and you engage, and all of a sudden you rethink your Christianity so that you find a Christianity that says it's acceptable. And I find sometimes that when it's your beloved grandchild or someone that you really love, that Christians that I guess are weakly aligned to the faith, they find a way to rethink themselves into another Christian position. I believe that that's dangerous. And it's dangerous, too, because if you really believe what the Bible says, and you're a Bible-believing Christian, you know that there are consequences for our choices. And if you believe that there is a heaven, there is a hell, and whether or not, we're talking about heaven or hell, if we make choices that result in weakening our bodies in some sort of way, or poor health, or all of those things, we suffer as a consequence. And so the suffering can just be on earth, but there are actions have consequences. Behavior choices have consequences. With the political correctness movement and the effort to silence everyone, it's very difficult to get information about the consequences of a person, living an LGBT lifestyle, except if you go to their websites. If you go to their websites, you find that they do present information, but that's for people that are already into that lifestyle. They have tried to silence the rest of us so that we can't talk about it. But that is something that I think we need to be concerned about. One of the chapters is on higher learning and lower values, and that's about the university environment and, the sex weeks and just all that madness, the safe spaces, trigger warnings, microaggressions, what is this pronoun? I forget the name of this pronoun confusion stuff, where you choose your personal he, z, t. What do they call it? Yeah, something like that. But where people some of them now put at the end of the email which gender pronoun they want to be called. And ze is one of the choices. All of that stuff, to me is not a high day for the university. And what I find with universities now is that they're not teaching critical thinking. They're teaching people what to think. And if you don't think what they want you to think, then there's hell to pay. There's going to be ostracism, and for some students, they want to go to law school, they want to go to medical school, and we need them in those places. Sometimes they have to hide who they are. I mean, talk about not being who you are. They have to, sometimes to survive, they feel like that they have to hide who they are. There are other students who are not wired that way. They're more wired like me, what you see, what you get. And so, you put yourself out there and you suffer the consequences. Sometimes it works to your advantage. Sometimes it works against you. But our children are having to make hard choices that they should not be confronting in college. And they're not getting a serious education at most institutions. And I question, the parents and grandparents of means, and maybe some of them inherited their money from godly grandparents, and they have these trust funds, and they use that money to send their children to colleges that's going to destroy their faith. And the money, that great-grandpa earned will be used to support values and principles that are totally antithetical to what the parents stood for. But that's where we are. And there's another chapter that's very relevant today, Black Robes Bring Dark Days, and it focuses on judicial activism and how judicial activism has thwarted the power of we the people. You think about this election, and I say that was a we the people moment. Well, you win the presidency, you have a more conservative president that's promised to support, traditional values to a certain extent, modified for modern days. But we have what we have. What we have with the judicial activism is situations where one person, like this judge, that was able to impose a nationwide ban on the president's executive order, even though it's not grounded, the reasoning in his judicial argument is not grounded in the Constitution at all, but he's able to impede. And if you look at the judiciary, there's a reason why, it's been called the most dangerous branch. It was judicial decrees that removed the 10 commandments from public places. And you think about it, why would someone feel threatened by the 10 commandments in a public place? Why? I mean, it doesn't make a lot of sense, especially if you're an atheist. You don't believe it's anything to it anyway. It's just nonsense. So that shouldn't threaten you. The judges have changed the definition of marriage. They've imposed taxes. They've created rights never stated in the Constitution, such as the right to abortion, same-sex marriage. And it's a serious threat to the democratic system, and it's also a threat to our children because we see in many of these cases that the decisions have a total disregard for the well-being of children. So we do have situations where there are children that have been adopted into families where the parents announce that the child is transgender. And these kids can be pre-adolescents and have permission. Somehow they're able to get permission for doctors to prescribe hormones to prevent them from developing. And in a world that was serious, in a world that used common sense, that would be child abuse. But we are allowing that to take place. And we look at the liberal left's war on children. It starts while they are in the womb because they are devalued from the moment of conception. And if they happen to be born, then there's just the laws and the effort to remove the child and to push a state, in many ways, imposed set of values and principles on the child. That devalues the children because for many of them, it's pushing them into lifestyles where they're going to have these harmful consequences. So parents really need to know what's happening. You may think you know what's happening, but I think most parents really don't. And I want to just read a few things that took place in public schools. Some of these were in public schools that the parents, in most cases, didn't know this was happening. There was a middle school in Minnesota that took middle and high school students on a field trip to a sex novelty shop. in 2015. This was our parental permission. The Boston public school system distributed 40,000 donated condoms, wonder who paid for those, to teens. Parents who supported the distribution of condoms complained about the labels that included One Lucky Lady, Hump One, and Tasty One. This was Massachusetts, that city on the hill, the shining city on the hill, 2014. A taxpayer-funded adolescent sexuality conference teaches teens how to use meth to heighten their sexual experiences. Conference organizers distributed a pamphlet offering tips on oral sex and prostate stimulation. This is your public schools. A judge sentenced a female teacher to 30 days in jail for having sex with a male high school student, Pennsylvania. The judge described the teacher as dangling candy and asked what young man wouldn't jump on that candy. So, there you have it. Your public schools are in action. But, many of these types of things can happen and may be more prevalent in private schools. And, what can you do? Well, there are a lot of things I think that you can do. If you can afford to do it and you can pool with other parents, I highly recommend homeschooling and also watching, because some states and some localities are trying to remove the rights of parents to homeschool or to make it more difficult. Or sending your child, if you do have that generational wealth, send them to classical Christian schools, where they're going to learn, the Greek, the Latin, as well as the history, Western civilization, all of this stuff. Send them to a classical Christian school. And when it comes to colleges and universities, there are some that are committed, to traditional, Western culture. They may not be Christian, but they are universities where they still pursue education as a marketplace of ideas, that they're not trying to indoctrinate the students. And I think that's the only responsible thing that you can do, with your great-grandpappy's money or money that you may have earned. If you are conservative and you want to help your children by sending them to college, then you need to exercise some authority about where your money is spent. Other things that we talk about, and it's important, is that people need to educate themselves about the Marxist roots of everything that's taken place. And when President Obama was elected and people talked about Marxism and communism, they got mocked a lot. They were conspiracy theorists. But if you read the works of Cleon Skousen, he wrote a book in the late 1950s, 1958, called The Naked Communists. And in the back of his book, he had a list of what he then called current communist goals. There were 45 goals. Those were read into the congressional record in 1963 by a congressman from Florida. And I talk about some of those goals because if you see what's taking place in our society, even the unrest, the resistance to the president, it's just like a playbook out of this Marxist agenda. And then most people just don't know what's taking place. But of those goals that Cleon Skousen, who was a Mormon scholar and he had been an FBI agent, had in his book, one was to capture one or both of the political parties in the United States. I would argue they have one and they're working on the other. Use technical decisions of the courts to weaken basic American institutions by claiming their activities violate civil rights. Get control of the schools, use them as transmission belts for socialism and current communist propaganda. Soften the curriculum, get control of teachers' associations, put the party line in textbooks. Gain control of all student newspapers, use student riots to foment public protests against programs or organizations which are under attack, infiltrate the press, gain control of key positions in radio, TV, and motion pictures, discredit the American culture, control art critics and directions of art museums, eliminate all laws governing obscenity by calling them censorship and a violation of free speech and free press, break down cultural standards of morality by promoting pornography and obscenity in books, magazines, motion pictures, radio, and TV, present homosexuality, degeneracy, and promiscuity as normal, natural, and healthy, infiltrate the churches, and replace revealed religion with social religion, discredit the Bible, and emphasize the need for intellectual maturity, which does not need a religious crutch, eliminate prayer or any phase of religious expression in the schools, and it goes on and on. You get the picture that what we see today didn't just happen by itself. And the more information that you have, the better able you are to counter what's taking place. And so getting information, educating yourself, we advocate also that you get your information from conservative alternative media as well as the mainstream media. And the reason I say both is you have to know what the political left is doing and how they're doing it. And so it's really important, to read the New York Times, the Washington Post, and other mainstream newspapers. But at the same time, you need to be looking at Breitbart and Drudge. The Drudge headline, they report a lot of news that you're not going to see in the mainstream news. And when you look at the liberal left, a lot of their blogs, a lot of conservative blogs, National Review, is a good source when they're not, injecting themselves in politics the way they did in the last election. But there are some writers with the National Review and just so many alternative sources of news that we can go to now as part of a way to educate ourselves. In the book, we show that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. And some of the people that we use as examples, there's a lady named Lisa Abler from Kentucky. She's a mom who started Vacation Liberty School. And you may be familiar with Vacation Bible School, was based on the same principles, but it's to teach children about the Constitution and about liberty and freedom. And think about the founders of Trail Life USA and American Heritage Girls. Those were created as alternatives to the Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts, who pretty much have been taken over. Other ways that we, the people, can protect our children and become more involved, listening to our children, being involved to the extent possible in the schools. Even if you don't have children, we all have a stake. And when I think about our children, this book is written primarily for Christian parents, but it's really written for all parents, because there are people that are not Christians and they're not Jews. They're not on board with what's happening in our schools. They want their children to have childhoods. They don't want their innocence stolen. And so I think we have to have allies wherever we can find them. Just like Jesus said, if they're not against us, I don't know the exact quote, but as long as they're not, what's the quote? If they're not, against us, pretty much, I'm going to have someone quote it so I can get it right. Well, that's the idea. Okay. That we need allies. And sometimes our allies will be people that are classical liberals. They may be atheists, but they believe in, the Constitution. They believe in Judeo-Christian American values, and they show it in their lifestyles. And so I think it's important for us to have allies like that and to respect, those people that have made different choices than the ones that we have made, because we are at war. And I think that in a wartime situation, you have to have strategies. And one of the strategies that I advocate is for people, if you want to be an activist, then you read the literature of the political left. You read Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals. Reread George Orwell's 1984. Reread the Communist Manifesto, but read it through new eyes, trying to figure out, okay, this is what they're doing, and thinking of ways to counter it. Some of the obvious ways, that we advocate for people is to use that social media. That has empowered a lot of people. Use the social media, obviously run for office, volunteer, give to campaigns. This past election, I was able to volunteer through something called the Mighty American Strike Force that was founded by Rick Potter in Texas, and it uses all this military, language, but they actually put boots on the ground, people, volunteers in the battleground states where we knocked on doors and we focused on those states. And so I was in Pennsylvania. That was not a state that was supposed to go red, but we know that it did. But I mean, this was an ordinary person that came up with an idea, and what he started in Texas with George W. Bush now is going, nationwide. There are many of us that have creative ideas, and I don't believe God has given up on America. We should not give up on America, but it's going to take everything that we have. It's going to take the prayer. It's going to take the fasting. It's going to take the activism, just everything that you have, and just the creative action to change this culture. But the most important resource is our children, and they're going to be the ones that will be our leaders. Do you want the political left indoctrinating them, or do you want your values and principles in them deeply enough that they will be able to stand and fight? I think most of us want our children to be able to stand and fight for this nation, and to do that, we have to change what we've been doing. We have to awaken to our times. Thank you, and I'll take questions. And I forgot to tell you where you can get the book. The book can be purchased at online, through Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, or through my website. In fact, I have a slight preference for my website. And I have a CD version narrated by me. Let's see what else. And it's on Audibles. So, you can download it and listen to it while you're walking or jogging. Thank you.
Dr. Swain, thank you so much. First of all, want to say we're looking at comments on Facebook Live right now, and you've had 2 people ask for you to run for president. So I don't know if you want to do that anytime soon, but, your next phase of life, just think about it.
Over the course of my life, I probably had 400 people, but I never took it seriously. That's why I haven't entered the fray yet.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to hear you speak. I find your perspective to be very, very refreshing.
Thank you.
And but I wanted to ask you, you did mention something, and I'm sure that you will be challenged on certain things if you appear and you've dealt with certain questions. Divorce must have been a difficult circumstance. You said that did you say you were divorcee?
I am a divorcee, and in fact, I've been divorced twice, I might announce. I married when I was 16, divorced when I was 20, remarried when I was 24, divorced when I was 34. I'm 62 now. And so those divorces happened before I had my Christian conversion experience. But given the divorce rate in the church, I could have been in the church and the same thing happened. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I don't... in my book, Be the People, A Call to Reclaim America's Faith and Promise, I have a chapter on the family, and I share, God has wired me to be transparent. When I talk about abortions, I talk about my own abortion that I had in my early 20s. And so, with me, what you see is what you get, take it or leave it. I'm out here for the kingdom. I've had a real life. And by sharing it, hopefully it will empower other people, put themselves out there and not be afraid about what people might or can use against you.
As an educator, I was wondering, we had this really bitter, awful confirmation process with Secretary DeVos that culminated yesterday in a historic vote for the vice president. Actually, it was the first time that broke the tie for a nominee to get them through the Senate. And given this sort of what you're talking about with education, I mean, it's clear that you would probably favor educational choice. And what's your take on this, what happened?
Well, I mean, everything that involves the Trump administration, we have to view it through the lens of how he was elected. He has all the forces of the elite, the liberal left, whether it's the universities, many of the judges, the media, liberal Republicans, the rhinos, all of those people are arrayed against him. And if that were not the case, we would not have had the situation that led to the historic vote. I believe in school choice. I would like to see voucher programs. I'd like to see more homeschooling. I would like to see the end of Common Core, because it's just common indoctrination, and the power returned to the states. And you know, under federalism, the states were supposed to be the laboratories where you could experiment, and you know, if people don't like what one state is doing, they could always vote with their feet. I think that we have to restore power to the states, but I would not read too much into what happened yesterday or that Judge Robart's decision to put a nationwide ban. And have anyone read the Harvard amicus brief about the immigration ban? It's all about them. It's all about them. It's nothing about the national security. And unless I missed something, it's not even granted in the Constitution. It's about how it's going to, how they see that it's going to affect their mission, and their mission is to bring in people from all over the world. And we know that there's nothing about that temporary ban that's going to affect the mission of a college and university. At most, it's a minor inconvenience. And so we find that our colleges and universities, I believe 38 at least, signed a letter that they're being hypocritical and dishonest. You all ought to call them out on that.
Thank you, Dr. Swain. I'm Peter Sprigg with Family Research Council, and I wanted to ask another education-related question. One thing I've observed is that liberals are big on touting science, that science is on their side on a lot of the issues. But my observation has been that, particularly on issues of human sexuality, they will actually ignore what the science says. So I wondered if you would just comment on that, about the left's tendency to use science as a weapon, but as you said, not really engage in critical thinking.
Well, I think it's interesting that the liberal left has sort of boxed themselves into a situation on this transgender, I don't know what to call it, debate or crusade. It's a crusade. They have boxed themselves into a situation because they are denying, you know, the science that they've always heralded themselves. They were above all of us because they followed the science, but they reject the science in a way that I don't think that they can justify. But also what is more serious, and especially when it comes to our children, is that the research shows that when people get sexual reassignment surgery, that for one thing, the people that really have gender dysphoria, those that really do believe that they were born in the wrong body, that they have serious psychological problems. That's been documented. And when they do get the gender reassignment, they tend to be even more miserable. They have a higher rate of suicide. If you actually cared about the people that were suffering from that painful situation, I can't imagine what it would be like. I just know it would be painful. The cruelest thing is to deny them, you know, or encourage them to get the help that they need, and especially in situations involving children. And I find that is not happening. It does not make a lot of sense, and it shows that the liberal left would rather use people for their own agenda and their own purposes than to actually do things that would help the individuals have a better quality of life. It's just madness. They use children, and they're using, you know, people in that transgender community, such as, what's his name, Caitlyn Jenner. You know, there was a lot of reports that Caitlyn was thinking about going back to being Bruce. If he goes back to Bruce, you know, his life would probably be in danger because he's a symbol, and that would hurt their agenda. They don't care about the people, they care about the agenda. And I have found that the bullying that's taken place on the part of the political left, in particular the LGBT community, is something that should be unacceptable. And it should be unacceptable that you had these corporations. When I was in college, and especially my first degree was in business, you know, corporations were supposed to make profits for their shareholders. All of a sudden, you had these corporations going out, taking controversial positions that hurt, you know, the bottom line. And so they're putting their personal feelings, their personal goals above that of the stockholders. I think that's a dangerous situation, and that we would be better served as a nation if corporations, moved away from that and got back to the business of making profits for whatever organization, whatever. They make widgets, then focus on making widgets. Yes.
Very good talk. On your last point, my observation has been corporations are really bullied into funding these various leftist causes. It's not that the leadership is that way. They just they get a lot of angry letters if they don't do it the bidding of these people. But
there's more of us than there are of them.
But we're not noisy enough.
Well, I don't know.
We've been too quiet for too long, I think.
And something, when I think about the college campus situation where conservatives, on a lot of campuses, I think conservative students are the majority, but they're so intimidated. They're not going to ask for safe space. And, we don't really want them to, but they're not going to ask for a safe space. They're not going to report the bullying. But, they're the real victims now.
That was my next question. I of course applaud these various startup colleges and homeschooling and all that really are doing great things. But I think we've kind of given up on the big institutions. I think we could perhaps bend them more back to their true nature and the nature of man, and more our principles. Perhaps with if we were noisier and more organized and focused in our efforts, rather than just sort of turn away from them.
Well, something that's more money that the liberal left seems to have to dangle before the college administrators. And you think about the once Christian schools, Belmont University in Tennessee, Vanderbilt. We can go down a whole list of universities. If you do the historical analysis, it had to do with them wanting secular money that had strings attached to it. And so they jettisoned their Christian identity to get the money. And nowadays, we can encourage parents and trustees and people not to give to the universities that suppress conservatives and people of faith, but there's a lot of money on the other side, and we have to find a way to counterbalance that. Now, some of it is coming from a few people like George Soros and, maybe the Gates Foundation, but until conservatives are conservative enough to put their money behind their values, you get more of the same. And, on the left, they point to the Koch brothers. Well, they are libertarians. They're not, they're not out there for Judeo-Christian values and principles. And so we don't have an equivalent to George Soros that I'm aware of where they are pouring money into supporting their values and principles. And it doesn't make sense because we're familiar with the scriptures that God owns the cattle on 1,000 hills, and all the silver and gold, belongs to him. And, the Christians that have wealth, I think they're doing a lot of good things in the world, and but they're not using it in a way that gets them any influence with these colleges and universities. And but I don't see, continuing to send my own child or the children I care about necessarily into those places to be sacrificed unless the child feels called to go there. Maybe someone's called to go there. Maybe that's their mission field. Instead of going to China or India, they want to go to Harvard for the purpose of evangelizing, or Yale or somewhere like that. There are situations, and I do believe God is raising up leaders on those campuses. And I think that there's a serious situation involving the Christians on those campuses, that they're so cowarded. And they want everybody to love them. And people are not going to love them, whether or not they keep their mouths shut or whether or not they stand for Christian values and principles. So they might as well stand. But many of them are just cowarded. And it's a sad situation, but it's not one that I believe is irreversible. I think that the political left is pushing so far that, there's a rubber band that's going to snap, or the pendulum is going to swing back in the other direction. And I would imagine, there's going to be a long time before you have another Democratic president. And people say, well, with all the, with the diversity, and all the immigrants and the minority vote and all this stuff like that, Democrats are going to stay in power, I think that they've gone so far to the left that they can't even count on members of those constituencies they thought they would always have. I think that there is a point of no return, and that they've made some decisions as to who they align themselves with, that anyone, that just has the conscience that God gave every human being, they apply their conscience. They're not going to be comfortable with things that the Democratic Party stand for. Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Swain. Dean Nelson, I serve actually here at FRC. First, I'll say it's Luke chapter 9 and verse 50, that verse that you were looking for. Jesus said, for whoever is not against you is for you.
All right. Okay. That's what I want. That's what I need. And that's where we need to keep that in mind. And so everyone doesn't have to look like us or even be the same faith or religion as us. If they share our values, and they really do share our values, then we should be willing, or we should make alliances that are like-minded and work towards, changing this culture. Otherwise, I think that we are doomed as a nation. And there's more at stake, I believe, than people realize. If we as Christians believe that God changes not and that he deals with nations, the way that he dealt with nations in the past, then, America is poised for judgment. I think with President Trump, we've gotten a reprieve. It's up to us what we do with that. And with him, we really do need to be praying for him and his political appointees. And, some of them maybe they should fail. Maybe there's some people that are not supposed to get through. And when that happens, we trust God, right? And so don't read too much in it if some of those nominees don't get through. And we also should pray about who's advising the president, who has the president's ear, because there can be advisors in there. We know that secret conversations between world leaders have leaked out. So obviously there are moles around the president. We don't want those moles, even if they're in the Republican Party, giving advice, that will undermine this victory.
Maybe it's a two-part question, but you've spoken one about homeschooling, which I'm a homeschooling parent. I've also been involved for about 20 years with campus ministry, and you touched on that a little bit. My question is, are there any other bright spots within our culture for our movement that you might be able to highlight? Like if there's a segment where you can say, hey, we need to put more fuel behind this type of effort, or we need to, highlight this, what would those things be? And the second part is, as an African-American conservative, I'll say it this way. I saw today a list of events that the RNC is doing this month, maybe several of them, and not one of them was Black History related. And so my second part is there any hope in reaching out, in your opinion, to the minority community to engage them in this culture fight?
Well, I certainly believe that, that there is hope and minorities need to be engaged. There's so much deception. And some of you may know that I was in the movie Hillary's America, The Secret History of the Democratic Party. A lot of people don't know the history of the Democratic Party. And it's not just ancient history. I mean, it's current history, how minorities are used and manipulated, and how the programs and policies are not working to their self-interest. And so, just hopefully, if Mr. Trump is able to accomplish some of the things that he would like to accomplish when it comes to the economy, when it comes, to illegal immigration, and just go down the list, if it improves the conditions of people that are living, in the inner cities and places like that, I think that would be a step in the right direction. Also, believe that, with the White House, that there are things that they have to watch out for. Again, I mean, I've already talked about who's talking with the president. Like if the president gets his advice, from liberal Democrats or Republican elites that may be minorities, he's not going to be able to craft any kind of solutions that's going to address those problems, because they're going to want the same old, and the same old has not worked. And I'm not concerned whether or not they have a Black History event at the White House, because, I mean, at the end of the day, a Black History event is an event, and we sort of go through all of that. But it would be far better to highlight what Black people have contributed, to American history throughout, because we are a part of American history, and not to create these situations, because there are many situations where if you're a Black person and you don't belong. Like for me, when I am a political scientist, but I never was really involved with the Black Political Science Association, and I was not involved with Mr. Trump's diversity coalition. It seems that a lot of times well-meaning white people will try to shuttle all the minorities into these minority organizations, and they don't have time to listen to anyone that chooses to be an American and not to be a part of those organizations. And I've chosen, not to spend my time being involved in certain kinds of organizations. I'm part of Christian Women in the Media, but mostly, I just do my life. I'm not a part of a lot of identity group politics. And I think that the only identity we need to be focusing on is the American national identity. And for African Americans, people of color, we have a stake in an orderly society, the rule of law. You look at all the crime that's taken place. Many of the people that have come here illegally have come from countries in chaos where there is no rule of law. And when they come here, there should be an expectation that we're going to follow our Constitution, that we're going to enforce the laws. We're not doing that. So what kind of message are we sending to these people? We're sending a message that we're just like the countries that they fled from. And I think that's a dangerous mistake.
Thank you so much, Dr. Swain, for that wonderful message. It's very, very much needed right now in our days and times. Would like to tell everyone watching online and everyone here at FRC, if you want to get more information on Dr. Swain, please go to carolmswain.net, carolmswain.net. Okay, and bethepeopletv.com if you want more information or you want to invite her to come speak. So thank you once again. And if you want to look through Dr. Swain's book while she's here, please come up to us and we will give you an article, a free bookmark, and let you see the book as well. Thank you so much.